At the wedding, the bride's parents openly showed disdain toward the groom's family because they were people of color. However, when they saw the gift brought by the groom's father, everyone was left shocked and speechless. Some mirrors don't just reflect what's outside, they reveal what's deep inside us. Nolan's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of wisdom he'd gathered over the decades. He stood calmly behind his son, his calloused hands gently smoothing the fabric across Jean's broad shoulders. Jean stared into the polished mirror, its glimmering surface reflecting back a version of himself that didn't quite feel real. The neat, sharp-cut suit felt borrowed, and the shining cufflinks seemed oddly foreign against his deep brown skin. He sighed softly, the heaviness of the moment settling around him. "I don't belong here, Dad," Jean murmured, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Not like this." Nolan smiled softly, meeting his son's anxious eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Son, you've earned your place. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Jean nodded slowly, trying to believe those words, trying to hold on to their comforting truth. But in the back of his mind, whispers of doubt echoed louder than reassurance. Those whispers carried familiar voices, voices of judgment and prejudice, voices he'd heard all too often since he'd met Lily. Outside the small dressing room, the hum of distant laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses reminded Jean of the world he was stepping into, a world far removed from his upbringing, a world that saw his father, a hard-working janitor and a proud veteran, as something lesser. "Do you ever regret it?" Jean asked softly, turning to face his father directly. "Do you ever regret all you've sacrificed, just to be looked down on by people like them?" Nolan shook his head firmly, his eyes steady and warm. "Regret? No. There's dignity in honest work. There's dignity in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. If they choose not to see it, that's their blindness, not mine." Jean studied his father's face, etched with lines of experience, quiet strength, and a deep resilience that came from fighting battles far beyond his own. Nolan had survived the violence of war, the pain of loss, and decades of quiet prejudice. And still, he stood unbroken, his back straight, his head held high. "But it's different now," Jean said, frustration simmering beneath his words. "It's not just about you and me. It's about Lily, her parents, what they think of us." Nolan placed his hand firmly on Jean's shoulder, his voice steady and soothing. "Listen to me, son. People will always see what they choose to see. You can't change their minds by trying to fit into their picture of perfection. All you can do is show them who you are without apology." Jean exhaled slowly, letting his father's words wash over him, quieting the storm within, at least momentarily. Outside, the chatter grew louder as the guests filtered into the luxurious ballroom, their polished shoes gliding across marble floors, their silk dresses shimmering under crystal chandeliers. Every part of it screamed exclusivity, privilege, wealth. Everything Jean had never known, everything Nolan had quietly battled against for years. As father and son walked towards the entrance of the ballroom, the whispers began almost immediately. Subtle glances darted in their direction, whispers that weren't loud enough to confront, but not quiet enough to ignore. "Did you see them?" A woman whispered to her companion, the thin edge of distaste sharpening her words. "Imagine Lily choosing someone like that," another voice hissed softly. Jean felt his shoulders tighten, anger flickering in his chest like sparks waiting to ignite. But Nolan simply touched his arm gently, guiding him forward. "Let them talk," Nolan whispered, his voice calm, strong, and unwavering. "Let them show themselves for who they truly are." George and Margaret stood near the entrance, their smiles carefully polite, their eyes sharp and calculating. Margaret stepped forward first, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Ah, Nolan, we've been so curious about you," she said lightly, eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Nolan's simple attire. "And remind me, what is it you do again?" I'm a janitor, Nolan answered calmly, holding her gaze. Honest, humble work. A quiet hush fell over the immediate group, discomfort evident as they exchanged furtive glances. George cleared his throat, his smile faltering slightly but quickly recovering. Of course, he added hastily. Very commendable. Lily, radiant in her soft ivory dress, appeared at Jean's side. Her eyes sparkled warmly, filled with an unwavering pride and affection that spoke volumes louder than words. I'm so glad you're here, Lily whispered to Nolan, sincerity evident in her gentle voice. Jean is so lucky to have you as his father. Nolan smiled softly at Lily, warmth spreading in his chest at the sincerity in her eyes. But as he looked around the lavishly decorated room, the divide between them felt deeper than ever. A chasm, carved by prejudice, privilege, and generations of misunderstanding. Yet Nolan knew, deep in his heart, that the worth of a man was never measured by wealth or status, but by integrity, kindness, and strength of character. As he stood beside his son, he silently resolved that tonight would not be about fitting into their world. The grandeur of the banquet hall glittered deceptively beneath crystal chandeliers, masking the quiet storm that simmered beneath. Gentle notes from the string quartet drifted across polished marble floors, but beneath those melodies lurked whispers sharper than glass. Jean felt each hushed comment stab like tiny blades into his skin as he and Nolan moved through the crowded room. Every step felt heavy, burdened by eyes filled not with welcome but judgment. "Who's that man again?" whispered one woman, her voice dripping with a thin veneer of politeness. "Oh, just some janitor," her companion answered quietly, but not quietly enough. Nolan, a veteran at weathering storms far harsher than this, continued forward, his back straight, his expression serene. His composure was unwavering, a quiet rebellion against the whispers swirling around them. But Jean could feel every glance and every whispered mockery, and anger rose hot within him. They reached the table set prominently near the front, where Lily's parents, George and Margaret, sat stiffly upright. Their neutral expressions, carefully practiced, barely concealed the disdain simmering beneath. George's gaze briefly met Nolan's, the elder man's eyes narrowing imperceptibly. Lily attempted a gentle smile, reaching over to squeeze Jean's hand reassuringly, but her warm gesture did little to thaw the chill radiating from her parents. George stood abruptly, the room quieting respectfully at the sound of his knife lightly tapping against a crystal champagne glass. He cleared his throat, wearing an insincere smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to see you all here tonight, joining us in this unique union," he began, carefully choosing his words. "When two families from vastly different worlds come together, it's always a fascinating occasion." Jean's jaw tightened slightly at the subtle jab. Nolan remained unmoved, his eyes steady, fixed on George without hostility or fear. George continued smoothly, his voice practiced, polished with a lifetime of privilege. "Tonight, we see clearly how love can bridge many things: background, education, even profession." He glanced pointedly at Nolan, a fleeting smirk crossing his lips. "Let's toast to love, then, and to the courage of overcoming differences." Polite applause rippled around the room, a thin veil masking the tension beneath. Jean could hardly contain his frustration, but Nolan reached out discreetly, resting a calming hand on his son's shoulder, silently urging patience. Throughout dinner, Nolan became the reluctant centerpiece of conversation. Questions fired like subtle darts, wrapped delicately in silk, yet carrying a biting sting beneath. "How remarkable," said one older man across the table, with carefully feigned admiration. "That a janitor could raise a son so accomplished. You must have faced great difficulties." Nolan met his gaze steadily, his voice calm and measured. "Life is never easy, sir, but hard work and integrity go a long way. I did my best." The older man's smile was condescending, as if Nolan's quiet dignity amused him. He pressed further, clearly seeking entertainment from Nolan's discomfort. Still, I must say, it seems unlikely that mopping floors would produce such remarkable success. One wonders how you managed. Gene's fingers tightened involuntarily around his fork, frustration radiating from him in waves. Nolan glanced at him, a silent reminder to stay composed. Turning back, Nolan smiled quietly. "I mop floors, sir," Nolan answered gently, his voice filled with quiet strength. "But I've never bowed my head to the hardships life threw at me. There's dignity in every job that keeps a family fed and safe." The table fell silent momentarily, briefly embarrassed by Nolan's calm strength. But Margaret quickly broke the uncomfortable silence, leaning toward a friend, her voice hushed yet deliberately audible. "I'm simply curious about the wedding gift," she murmured, eyes twinkling maliciously. "Perhaps a new mop and bucket?" The cruel laughter that followed cut Gene deeply. He clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles whitened, anger flashing in his eyes. Lily touched his arm gently, her worried glance urging calm. But it was Nolan's gaze, serene and unshaken, that truly steadied him. Nolan merely nodded slightly, conveying without words the necessity of enduring quietly, at least for tonight. Gene exhaled slowly, the fury within him dimming reluctantly to a simmer. He knew his father's resilience was a product of a lifetime spent surviving insults far more painful than tonight's whispered mockeries. He felt ashamed at his own impulse toward anger when his father had already weathered worse storms without complaint. The dinner slowly drew toward its end, the glittering chandeliers casting soft shadows across faces that, despite their refined masks, betrayed hidden thoughts. George, clearly unsatisfied with the evening's subtle cruelty, rose suddenly, drawing the eyes of every guest in the hall. His voice echoed confidently as he addressed the crowd, a sharp smile playing across his lips. "Before we finish tonight," George announced, his tone mocking beneath the thin veneer of politeness, "there's one more moment we've all been eagerly waiting for." He paused deliberately, letting anticipation swell. "A special gift from our groom's father." A ripple of laughter spread among those gathered, quick and fleeting, but sharp enough to cut. All eyes turned toward Nolan, waiting for embarrassment, shame, or anger, anything to confirm their judgments. But Nolan merely stood up quietly, his demeanor composed, his eyes calm. From beneath the table, he lifted a simple box wrapped in plain brown paper, devoid of ribbons or any ornate decorations. The humble appearance stood starkly apart from the lavishly adorned gifts piled high nearby, making it an immediate target of whispers. Gene watched his father step confidently forward, carrying the modest gift as though it were priceless. Lily stood beside him, nervous yet curious, her gentle grip on his hand tightening slightly. Nolan stopped before George, briefly meeting his eyes, not in anger nor in challenge, but with quiet strength. He placed the humble gift upon the table. The silence in the room grew thick and tangible, curiosity overtaking the mocking whispers. Gene and Lily carefully unwrapped the package together, peeling back layers of humble paper to reveal something astonishing beneath. There, illuminated softly under the ballroom lights, rested a painting bursting with life, a vibrant landscape that seemed almost alive, glowing with rich colors and skillful strokes. Eyes widened across the room as they absorbed its brilliance, until they inevitably drifted down to the lower corner, where a name boldly rested: Henri Delacroix. Gasps filled the hall, hushed murmurs cascading from table to table as recognition set in. Guests familiar with fine art exchanged shocked, whispered confirmations. A Delacroix was not simply a painting, it was a treasure. A work that carried with it prestige, history, and immense value. And yet here it lay, presented humbly, wrapped in plain brown paper by a man who cleaned floors for a living. Margaret visibly paled, her usual composed expression faltering entirely. George stood stunned, his mouth opening once, twice, before words finally emerged, shaky and uncertain. Is it authentic?" he stammered, disbelief thick in his voice. Nolan met his bewildered gaze calmly, nodding with serene certainty. Yes, it's genuine. Yes, It was gifted to my great-grandfather by Henri Delacroix himself. They were friends. My family has cherished it for generations, passing it down not for its monetary worth, but for the friendship, history, and values it represents. The silence that followed Nolan's quiet explanation was profound. Faces once filled with quiet contempt now shifted uncertainly, embarrassment and awe warring in their expressions. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward George, who was struggling to regain his composure, the humiliation clear on his flushed face. George, still visibly shaken, finally found his voice again, his tone edged sharply with confusion and resentment. If this painting is so valuable, Nolan, why on earth are you cleaning floors for a living? Nolan regarded him quietly for a moment, as if considering whether such a question deserved a response. When he spoke, his words were gentle, yet firm, quiet, yet profoundly impactful. I clean floors, George, Nolan began slowly, clearly, because honest labor has dignity, because every day I go home knowing my work is real, necessary, and honorable. This painting, valuable as it might be, isn't something to be sold to buy respect. I never lacked respect in my own heart, no matter how much others might have withheld theirs. Heads nodded quietly around the room. The previous tension slowly melted into genuine admiration, humility quietly taking root among those previously swept up in arrogance. The hall remained hushed, guests shifting in their seats, unable to tear their eyes away from Nolan as he stood quietly, still holding the attention of every soul present. His calm, steady breathing filled the brief silence, his eyes thoughtful, as if deciding whether to share more. Finally, with a gentle nod, Nolan moved closer to the microphone, his voice soft, unassuming, yet deeply resonant. I wasn't always a janitor, he began slowly, his voice drifting clearly through the grand hall. Long before I swept floors, I wore a different uniform, serving a country that I believed would always protect those who protected her. His gaze wandered briefly, settling on something distant, something only he could see. A faint, bittersweet smile touched his lips. I joined the army fresh out of high school, full of dreams, believing deeply in honor, duty, and sacrifice. Back then, I thought that courage alone could open every door. Nolan paused briefly, gathering himself. His hands tightened subtly at his sides, the only visible sign of the raw memories unfolding within him. When he spoke again, his words carried weight, quiet but piercing through years of buried pain. I served my country faithfully, earned medals, honors. But when I returned home, I quickly learned the harsh truth. Medals couldn't change the color of my skin. They couldn't buy acceptance, dignity, or even a simple chance at employment. The room, once filled with whispers of judgment, now stood in a humbled silence, listening to the quiet strength emanating from a man they'd so deeply misunderstood. Doors closed on me again and again, Nolan continued softly, without bitterness, but with profound sadness. My service meant nothing when faced with prejudice. Employers looked at my medals, then at my face, and suddenly there was no vacancy. After months of being turned away, I took the only job offered, janitor. And I did it proudly, because it was honest work, and it fed my son. Nolan's gaze moved to Jean, who stood rooted in place, eyes glistening, shoulders straight with pride. Beside him, Lily's tears silently traced her cheeks, her heart aching, as she finally understood the quiet strength and hidden pain beneath Nolan's humble demeanor. George shifted uncomfortably, the spotlight of Nolan's truth illuminating a prejudice he'd hidden beneath polished manners. Margaret averted her eyes, guilt creeping into her carefully constructed composure. George, desperate not to concede, gathered himself for one final jab, voice edged with bitterness, yet thin and strained. You think telling a sad story will make you worthy in the eyes of everyone here? Jean, silent until now, stepped forward sharply, his voice clear, firm, echoing boldly through the hall. You have no right at all, to judge my father, he said. A man's worth isn't determined by money or status, but by his courage, honor, and sacrifice. And tonight, Dad's shown he has more dignity in a single moment than you've shown your entire life. George opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. For the first time, he found himself stripped of power, confronted by a son whose dignity and strength he'd severely underestimated. Lily, standing beside Jean, spoke through her tears, voice trembling but fiercely resolute, turning to face her stunned parents directly. Tonight, I didn't just marry the man I love, she whispered, her voice clear and steady. I chose honesty over appearances, dignity over privilege. I choose truth over the empty values you've always hidden behind. Her words hung clearly in the air, leaving her parents shaken, speechless. Margaret reached instinctively for George's arm, their silence speaking volumes louder than any words. Across the room, heads bowed in quiet respect. Those who had whispered harsh judgments now looked inward, feeling a sharp sting of humility, their arrogance and ignorance laid bare by Nolan's quiet dignity. Jean turned to his father, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, pride unmistakable in his eyes. Dad, you've taught me tonight what true courage is. Not standing up in anger, but standing tall in dignity. Nolan smiled gently, nodding slowly, his voice softening with warmth. Son, true courage isn't about being loud. It's about being true to who you are, no matter how hard the world pushes back. The soft hum of quiet respect settled over the room, the tension now replaced by genuine reflection. Nolan quietly took his seat, allowing himself a brief moment of peace. But George, humiliated yet unwilling to surrender, rose sharply, his mask of calmness slipping back into place. His eyes fixed harshly on Jean and Lily, signaling them wordlessly to follow him away from prying ears. They moved toward a secluded corner of the grand hall, Margaret trailing nervously behind, fingers trembling slightly as she held tightly onto George's arm. Away from the watchful eyes of their guests, George's polished facade cracked completely, his voice laced with barely contained anger and desperation. Lily, he started, carefully choosing words meant to wound yet coax her back. If you insist on walking this path, understand clearly, you'll lose everything we've worked a lifetime to build. The fortune, the reputation, your status, everything. His words, sharp and cold, hung heavily in the air, designed to instill fear and obedience. But Lily, for the first time in her life, met her father's gaze squarely, unflinching. Her voice was steady, clear, and surprisingly calm. And if I lose everything? She asked softly, her voice cutting through George's confidence. What exactly will I have left? George's mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. Margaret, sensing the fragile moment slipping away, quickly intervened, her voice gentle but pleading. Sweetheart, please, we're only worried about your future. Lily shook her head gently, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. No, Mom, you're worried about you, about appearances, about dinners where people smile politely but never speak their truth. Margaret recoiled slightly, visibly hurt, yet unwilling or unable to deny her daughter's words. The silence stretched painfully between them, an acknowledgement of bitter truths long hidden beneath practiced smiles. Jean, standing protectively beside Lily, felt her strength and mirrored it. His grip tightened reassuringly around her hand, sending quiet strength through his touch. His eyes locked firmly onto George, clear and unwavering. Do you honestly believe, Jean asked, his voice soft yet deeply firm, that we need your money or your approval to find happiness? We don't. We never did. All we need is each other. George turned sharply toward Jean, eyes narrowed, filled with disdain. But the power behind his gaze had evaporated. Jean stood tall, head high, shoulders squared. He refused to bend under George's bitterness. Lily, too, stood beside him, eyes clear, dry and resolute. No longer were they frightened children living under the shadow of George and Margaret's expectations. Realizing his last grip on authority slipping, George's voice hardened, a final, desperate threat spilling from his lips. "If you both leave tonight," he warned, voice trembling slightly, "I'll cut off everything. You'll walk away with nothing." The air grew heavy, still, and charged with meaning. Lily slowly turned to face him, a calm determination radiating clearly from every part of her. Her voice was gentle but unyielding, carrying a weight no threat could diminish. "Then we'll rebuild," she said firmly, her words resonating quietly but powerfully. "We'll rebuild it all, together, with our own hands and our own love." George stood stunned, speechless for the first time. Margaret stared helplessly at her daughter, eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed openly. Their carefully constructed world, built on privilege and appearance, began crumbling quietly around them. Jean glanced briefly toward Nolan, who sat quietly across the room, eyes filled with quiet pride and understanding. In that brief look, Jean found a strength rooted deeply within, a strength his father had carefully nurtured through years of quiet, dignified example. "Let's go," Jean whispered gently to Lily, voice filled with tender confidence. She nodded silently, turning briefly toward her parents with a gentle yet final look, a look free from anger or bitterness, but filled instead with gentle sorrow for what could have been. Stepping out from the glittering hall, Nolan, Jean, and Lily found themselves beneath the vast, open night sky. The soft whispering of leaves replaced the hollow echo of applause, and judgmental stares dissolved into the comforting darkness around them. For the first time that evening, there was silence, not oppressive, but healing, gentle, full of promise. Lily trembled slightly, her quiet tears slipping down freely now, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being free. Jean drew her into a protective embrace, holding her closely, shielding her as though his arms could block out all that she'd bravely left behind. Nolan stood quietly beside them, a strong, gentle presence. His silence was comforting, like a steady tree offering shade and shelter, quietly watching over their tender moment. After a long pause, Nolan placed his hand lightly upon Jean's shoulder, a simple gesture that said everything words could not. Together, they moved toward Nolan's old car, parked just beyond the brightness of the elegant ballroom. Nolan gently settled the Delacroix painting safely beside him, resting securely against the worn upholstery. Its quiet dignity, its storied past now represented something deeper, a passage from one generation to the next, not of wealth or prestige, but of values, integrity, and dignity. The journey homeward was calm, almost wordless, filled instead with quiet thoughts and the hum of tires against asphalt. Eventually, Lily broke the silence, her voice soft and thoughtful, tinged with uncertainty yet filled with hope. "I wonder if my parents will ever change," she murmured quietly, staring thoughtfully out into the darkness. Nolan kept his eyes steadily on the road, but his voice was gentle and comforting. "People can always change, Lily," he answered slowly, carefully choosing his words. "But not because someone tells them to. They'll change when they're inspired by seeing the way you two live." Lily considered his words silently, finding truth and comfort in Nolan's quiet wisdom. Jean gently squeezed her hand, offering reassurance. Their path forward seemed clearer now, no longer obscured by others' expectations or shallow measures of success. When they arrived at Nolan's modest home, the soft glow of a porch lamp greeted them warmly. It was humble, not grand, yet to Lily and Jean, it now felt far more welcoming than any grand hall they'd ever entered. Inside, Nolan prepared tea as they settled around the small kitchen table, surrounded by the soothing glow of a simple hanging lamp. There was no elegant piano music, no expensive wines, no sparkling chandeliers. Yet this humble simplicity held something richer, more authentic. Peace, true peace, built not from status or image, but from sincerity and love. Jean watched his father quietly, marveling at his unwavering calm throughout the evening's events. Finally, curiosity nudged him to break the comfortable silence. "Dad," Jean began thoughtfully, his voice tinged with a quiet awe. "I've seen people say terrible things to you, yet you never once raised your voice. Why didn't you ever get angry?" Nolan paused briefly, considering his son's question with care. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and reflective, carrying years of experience and quiet understanding. "Because, son, the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand firm." Jean leaned back in his chair, absorbing those words deeply. It was a lesson he'd watched his father live his whole life, but only tonight fully understood its profound strength. Beside him, Lily nestled her head softly against his shoulder, finally smiling, her first true smile since the day had begun. "We'll rebuild," Lily said quietly, with newfound clarity and determination. "We'll start over again, not with money or fancy things, but with each other, the right person and the right heart." Nolan watched them both, his expression gentle, filled with quiet pride and warmth. He nodded slowly, deeply understanding their decision, respecting the courage it required. "That's the only thing," he said gently, eyes filled with wisdom and warmth, "that truly makes life worth living." The evening stretched quietly onward, the comforting tea, gentle warmth, and shared understanding filling the modest kitchen with tranquility. Beyond the window, stars glistened silently, seeming brighter than they had in years, no longer clouded by the artificial lights of wealth and judgment. In that quiet, simple space, Jean felt a deep and profound shift within himself. Tonight wasn't just a break from the past. It was a step toward becoming the man his father had quietly guided him toward being. He would carry forward Nolan's lessons, not in loud declarations, but in quiet dignity, humility, and compassion. The following morning brought with it a quiet glow, gentle sunlight filtering through worn curtains and casting warm rays across the living room walls. At its center, the Delacroix painting rested proudly above the modest fireplace, radiating a soft dignity entirely separate from its monetary worth. Jean stood silently before it, his gaze absorbed by the rich colors, the gentle brushstrokes that whispered of struggles long endured, yet ultimately overcome. After several quiet moments, he turned thoughtfully toward Nolan, who sat comfortably in his familiar chair, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. "Dad," Jean said softly, his voice thoughtful, reflective, "I think I'm finally starting to understand why this painting is so precious." Nolan's eyes sparkled softly as he rose from the chair, stepping over to his son and placing a gentle hand upon his shoulder. He, too, gazed at the painting, his voice filled with quiet warmth. "Not because of its monetary value," he murmured quietly, "but because of the story it carries, the legacy, the courage, the heart behind it." Jean nodded slowly, absorbing those words deeply. They settled warmly within him, like roots digging deep into the earth, grounding him in quiet purpose. Lily emerged from the small kitchen, carrying mugs filled with freshly brewed coffee, the rich aroma comforting in the simplicity of the morning. Setting the cups carefully on the modest wooden table, she considered their situation thoughtfully. It was true, the price of their newfound freedom was high, bank accounts frozen, family ties severed. Yet, the clear brightness in her eyes showed no regret, no longing for lost wealth or privilege. Her heart was content, lighter now than it had ever been. Handing Jean his coffee, Lily spoke clearly, softly, but with a quiet determination. "I'm ready to start over, Jean. I'll find a job, maybe teaching again." We'll rent a small apartment, something modest. But it'll be ours, built by our hands and by our own strength." Jean smiled softly, pride and affection clear in his eyes as he gently squeezed her hand. He saw in her now not just the woman he loved deeply, but also a partner ready to walk by his side, facing whatever the world threw at them. The prospect of struggle held no fear for them. Not anymore. The morning stretched gently onward. The three of them gathered comfortably in Nolan's living room, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. Soon, their discussion turned toward the future, not merely their personal dreams, but something deeper, more meaningful, a way to extend Nolan's lessons into tangible actions. Jean leaned forward, excitement glimmering softly in his eyes. "Dad, Lily and I were talking about something last night, something we want to build, something that reflects everything you've taught us." Nolan watched his son curiously, intrigued but patient, letting the young couple's ideas unfold naturally. "A community center," Lily continued softly, earnestly. "A place to help young people of color. A place where they can feel supported, inspired, where they can find dignity in themselves no matter what others might think." Jean nodded, his voice gentle but passionate. "We don't want your legacy just to be something we carry quietly. We want it to be seen, felt, something that changes lives just like you've changed ours." Nolan sat silently, absorbing their words deeply. A gentle smile slowly spread across his face, his eyes shimmering softly with emotion. He felt an overwhelming pride, not pride in himself, but pride in them, in what they had become, in how clearly and deeply they'd embraced the values he'd quietly tried to instill. Seeing Jean and Lily seated before him, dreaming earnestly about making a difference, Nolan felt as though he was looking back through time, glimpsing a younger version of himself, but better, brighter, clearer. His quiet choices had borne fruit, blooming in the lives and hearts of these two determined young people. Finally, as the day drew toward its quiet close, Nolan spoke again, his voice filled with warmth, wisdom, and quiet conviction. "Listen, son, remember this always. The true legacy isn't wealth. It's not property or status. The real legacy, the only one that truly matters, is what you leave behind in the hearts of others." Jean met his father's eyes steadily, engraving those simple yet powerful words deep into his memory. He knew they would guide him, like a beacon quietly shining, lighting the path he and Lily had chosen to walk together. In the weeks following their wedding, Nolan's modest house became a quiet refuge for Jean and Lily, sheltering them from judgment and offering them a fresh start. It was a humble beginning, nothing extravagant, just honest and real. Lily found work teaching at a local elementary school, greeting her students every morning with warmth and genuine care. Jean began volunteering at the community center, guiding young people, teaching them skills, values, and courage he himself had learned firsthand. There were no fancy dinners or glittering parties now, no crystal glasses or polished silverware, but each shared meal around Nolan's worn kitchen table tasted sweeter than anything they'd ever known. Every laugh, every gentle embrace carried a happiness that money simply couldn't buy, a happiness they'd never truly experienced before. Each morning, Nolan rose early, preparing coffee quietly, watering plants, tending the simple tasks that filled his days. His eyes watched gently over Jean and Lily, silently proud, protective, offering a quiet strength that anchored their new life. He never said much, but his presence spoke clearly, warmly. He would always be there, a steady rock in a world still learning how to let them live freely. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected shattered their peaceful routine. Nolan looked up from watering the geraniums as a car he recognized all too well pulled slowly into the driveway. Margaret stepped out hesitantly, not in her usual fine clothes and makeup, but looking exhausted, uncertain, almost fragile in the afternoon sun. She approached the porch slowly, eyes downcast, a woman stripped of the pride that had defined her for so long. Nolan met her quietly at the door, no trace of anger or resentment in his voice. "Come in." he said simply, guiding her gently inside. He poured tea for both of them, the gentle clinking of cups and saucers filling the silence between them. Margaret stared quietly into her cup, visibly wrestling with her own thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, humble, almost broken. "I was wrong," she admitted, struggling to look up into Nolan's gentle, patient eyes. "Not just about you, but about Lily. I thought I was protecting her, but all I did was hurt her." Nolan nodded quietly, no judgment, no resentment in his calm expression. He understood the pain in Margaret's confession, recognizing the courage it took to admit it. Before he could respond, the front door opened softly, and Lily stepped into the room, frozen in surprise at seeing her mother sitting there, unguarded and vulnerable. She didn't cry or shout. Lily's voice was calm, measured, but firm as she quietly asked, "Why are you here, Mom? What gives you the right?" Margaret lifted her gaze, filled now with an unfamiliar humility. "I came here not as your judge, Lily, but as someone finally learning how to be a mother again." Lily didn't rush into forgiveness. Trust could not be rebuilt overnight, but neither did she turn away. Jean stepped quietly to her side, his hand gently finding hers, offering quiet support and a strength born from love and understanding. "We don't need their approval, Lily," Jean said gently, clearly. "But if they're honestly trying to change, we can choose forgiveness. Not because they've earned it, but because we deserve peace." Lily absorbed his words deeply, feeling a quiet truth resonate within. Slowly, she nodded, meeting her mother's tear-filled eyes with gentle strength. Margaret didn't speak again, the silence between them heavy with meaning, regret, and the first tentative steps toward something new. That night, long after Margaret had left and quiet returned to the house, Nolan sat thoughtfully before the Delacroix painting, now lit warmly by soft lamplight. Jean quietly took the seat beside him, gazing at the painting that had come to represent so much more than art or value. "You were right, Dad," Jean whispered softly, thoughtfully. "We don't need anything but kindness, dignity, and love." Nolan placed a comforting hand upon his son's shoulder, his eyes reflecting warmth, wisdom, and deep satisfaction. "Son," he said gently, "real wealth isn't something you can lose. If you've lived your life true to what you believe, that's the only wealth worth having." Lily joined them, silently sitting down beside Jean, gently holding his hand. Together, the three of them stared quietly at the painting, a painting now freed from monetary worth, shining instead with lessons of strength, sacrifice, and unconditional love. It was no longer just a prized possession. It had become a symbol, reminding them all of the true purpose of their lives. As they sat quietly beneath its comforting presence, Nolan felt profound peace. He saw clearly now that his quiet legacy, the dignity, compassion, and courage he'd nurtured throughout his life, had finally blossomed fully, carried forward by Jean and Lily. Their decisions, their strength, their love, these were his legacy. A legacy untouched by wealth or judgment, protected forever by honesty and integrity. And in the warmth of their simple home, Nolan knew deeply that their story was just beginning. A new legacy, built not from riches or power, but from ordinary people brave enough to break free of prejudice, to embrace truth, and to live each day with quiet strength and unconditional love. Because in the end, the only true legacy, the one no one could ever take away, was the one they left behind in each other's hearts. The journey of Jean, Nolan, and Lily profoundly showcases the resilience of human dignity against prejudice and societal judgment. Nolan, through his quiet strength and humble integrity, impressively illustrates that true courage doesn't require loud declarations, but consistent, steadfast authenticity. Jean and Lily's courageous choice to reject superficial values in pursuit of genuine happiness underscores a critical lesson. True fulfillment comes not from wealth or social acceptance, but from honesty, love, and personal integrity. Their emotional journey, from conflict, humiliation, and struggle toward freedom, reconciliation, and inner peace deeply touches the reader, making their victory profoundly impactful. The powerful scene in which Margaret acknowledges her mistakes reinforces the possibility of redemption through humility and openness. Ultimately, the story provides a significant moral lesson. A meaningful legacy is not measured by material possessions, but by the compassion and respect one instills in others. The characters teach us the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and the quiet yet transformative power of living truthfully. Nolan's wisdom echoes clearly, resonating deeply. Real wealth lies within one's heart, expressed through kindness, dignity, and love, values which, once embraced, cannot be taken away by anyone. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.